All right, I'm going to give it one more minute. Ooh, someone is in Jamaica. I'm jealous. Okay, so we're 3 minutes after the hour. I think we can go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining Together We Thrive, How Allies Can Support the Work of ERGs. It's November 3rd at 12 Eastern Time. So thank you for taking your lunch hour or your morning hour to be with us this morning. So my name is Dan Mahle Consulting. I am co-founder of Chezi, and we are a management platform for ERGs. So we help you track membership, events, budget, engagement, et cetera, all with the goal of giving you time back to focus on the things that matter in terms of building an inclusive workplace. And speaking of inclusive workplaces, today we're going to be talking about how allies can stand with and stand up for the work of ERGs. And we are joined by our great guest, Dan Mahle. A little bit about Dan before I give him the mic. Dan Mahle is an executive coach and seasoned group facilitator with a passion for partnering with leaders to build more thriving, equitable, inclusive cultures. As a lifelong learner and culture champion, Dan helps leaders and teams to connect to their authentic power in accountable ways by exploring and expressing vital parts of themselves that are often undervalued in startup and corporate business environments. Dan is the founder of Wholehearted Masculine, a center for the exploration and development of wholehearted masculinities. There, Dan leads programs for people who seek to co-create and participate in healthier cultures of masculinity. As a storyteller, speaker, and trainer, Dan has developed and facilitated programs to support hundreds of senior leaders at organizations like Roche, Lockheed Martin, Choice Bank, and Tenet Health. As a writer and frequent podcast guest, Dan has been featured in Everyday Feminism, The Good Men Project, The Mankind Podcast, Yes Magazine, and Crosscut, among others. Dan can often be found hiking in the foothills near Boulder, Colorado, with his wife, daughter, and puppy. And we're super excited to have you, on this event with us today. So welcome, Dan. I'm going to pass you the mic. Just tell the audience who you are and what you do.
Thank you so much, Dumebi. It's wonderful to be here with you. Truly an honor. And one of the key focuses of my work is working with white male leaders, really to support them to journey inward, to become more courageous, confident, accountable partners in DEI work. And so that's a lot of the background that I have in supporting white men engaging in anti-racism and anti-sexism. Happens through that lens of how does it all connect and how does it influence and impact our culture and our leadership style in organizations.
Nice. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this work? Like, what was the background or your experience that led you to be, an active ally and active coach within the DEI space?
So I've been doing men's work for the past decade, and men's work is really just men gathering, sitting in circles, sharing about our feelings, our emotions, talking about struggles and celebrations and things in life. It's kind of countercultural because, a lot of men are trained to kind of be lone wolves and be out on our own. And men's work says, no, we should be in community. And so that work has been happening for quite a while, but I became really interested in gender equity and climate justice and kind of all these different elements. And I started to see, with a lot of support and a lot of loving care and mentorship, I started to see the way these were all interconnected. And that when we do the work, we have to look at it from an awareness of all the different elements together. And so it was actually a couple years ago when a dear friend and mentor of mine, a BIPOC woman, said, hey, we need you to come in and work with the white men in our organization. And so she was caucusing at the time. So she had people separating out into different groups based on identities and that sort of thing. And she said, we need somebody to come and work with the white men specifically. And could you do it? Yeah. And I said, well, I haven't done anything quite like that before. I mean, I had here and there, but not in an organizational context. And her invitation kind of, made me say, all right, this is it. I want to come in and try this. And it was really effective. It was really meaningful. And it really did support a lot of white male leaders in the organization to step forward and be partners in the work. And so that, I think, launched my passion for really engaging in DEI work specifically. But I will say on a more personal note, my interest and passion for racial justice and gender equity goes way back. And I'm thinking about, in particular, the Charleston shooting way back in 2015. I remember quite vividly sitting in a dark room late at night after that shooting had taken place with a candle and a dear friend of mine, is a Black man, and just looking into the faces of these people who were lost far too soon, and just saying, it's not okay. I'm not going to take a stand for that. And so what's my role? What can I do to be a part of some tiny part of shifting that culture that led to this mass murder? And so that's a bit of why I'm here and why I care so deeply about the work.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And I think it's interesting that like Charleston was that catalyst for you. Whereas I think for a lot of America, it was like the George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. I think that's where we really had like an awakening to racial injustice. That's where corporations and businesses really started paying attention. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Can you speak to why it's important for allies and more specifically white men to be involved in DEI at all? I imagine that you may get some pushback around this work just because given that diversity and inclusion is the only system or business function that is centered around marginalized groups, some may feel that white men or allies participating in it may be a distraction or may lose focus from like those groups or those communities. So can you speak to why ally involvement is important?
Sure. Yeah. Some of the skepticism and concern is really valid, by the way. And so I just want to say, I start by listening to that rather than saying, I know what's right, because I don't. I'm just here to learn with everybody else. And so, here's what I've come to discover is that I think when white male leaders and white men in general are not specifically included in DEI work, then we are, let's say at best, we are passively resistant and kind of not very involved. And at worst, we're actively resistant and actually getting in the way of progress. And so I think it is a missed opportunity to not specifically engage white men in the work for that reason. But I think that sometimes, like I've gotten the feedback, white male leaders have tons of spaces that center our experiences. Like, why do you need another space? And you're just going to like talk about your feelings or something. And this is the thing, like, a lot of white male leaders dominate the boardroom and many other spaces of power in organizations. And yet we are not vulnerable with each other in those spaces. We are not necessarily self-aware or emotionally intelligent in those spaces with each other. We don't take risks to be human together in those spaces. It's more about proving ourselves, about status, about power, and fitting into the hierarchy of sort of patriarchal masculinity. And so I think that's a misunderstanding a lot of people have, is that, oh, well, white men already have spaces. We don't have spaces specifically to do the work, to learn about anti-racism, to learn about actually the benefits that we gain from being in an up power position in domination-based culture, but also the costs, including the costs to us of being in a culture that in fact dehumanizes all of us, even as it oppresses certain groups. And so that's, I think, what really gets me fired up about this work, is recognizing that we have a stake in this, and we need to see that. We need to see that it's not about helping those people.
Right.
It's about helping all of us together as collaborators and partners in the work, and that it can only be truly effective when we're all involved.
Yeah. So knowing that you are the facilitator of these spaces and of these conversations with white male leaders, what is some of the feedback that you hear from them as you go about these discussions?
Well, it's interesting because oftentimes what can happen is when white men come together, the first thing we talk about is, ooh, it's challenging to be a white man engaging in DEI. And of course it's like, yeah, okay, that's challenging. Maybe not as challenging as being somebody who's
Right.
part of a marginalized group dealing with oppression,
Right.
right? But I mean, obviously not. But I think we have to start paradoxically by centering our own experience in white male spaces in order to learn how to decenter our experiences out in the rest of our workplace and life. And so the reason why that's important is because there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of shame, guilt, a lot of feelings that come up that you won't hear a lot of white men talk about, but that are under the surface, not always fully conscious to even to us, that come forward when all of a sudden we're put into the, like you said, the one area where we actually aren't leading, where we don't hold the power, and where we're invited to come in and participate. And so that can be really threatening. It can feel really scary. And rather than feeling scared and vulnerable, our training as men oftentimes is to take that emotion and instead feel defensive and feel angry and push it outward. And so that is what we start with in the groups, is we start with, what are you feeling? How are you impacting others with what you're feeling? How conscious are your feelings? And can we together start looking at having compassion and empathy for ourselves and sort of rehumanizing ourselves in community with each other, so that we can affirm and take a stand for and with the humanity of others?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So knowing that you are engaging in consulting engaging or like having these like facilitated practices, what advice do you have for organizations that want to look to encourage allies to get involved in DEI work, but don't have the resources to do the types of engagements that you provide?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say one of the first important things to do is to look for who means well, who just doesn't have all the information, but they really mean well. Find a couple people who you think could be partners, and invest some energy with them. So it could be that it's a senior executive or a leader, or even a CEO or a co-founder, who that like they really do care. They just don't quite know how to translate that care into action.
Yeah.
And maybe by, just building the relationship and sharing some stories and, doing some co-learning together, sharing some resources, they could be more interested in actually making DEI strategic instead of kind of off to the side in the organization. And once DEI initiatives become more strategic and more centralized across business processes and departments and all that, then typically it's resourced because the value is so clear. And so once it's resourced, and once we're actually paying people who are doing the unpaid labor, which by the way is very often women and women of color in particular, who are leading DEI initiatives without full compensation, if any compensation at all. And so we need to look at where is the unpaid labor happening, and we need to start as leaders by valuing that labor and uplifting that leadership. And then I think as we do that, there's more opportunity to bring someone in like me who can help those white male leaders kind of take their knowledge and their self-awareness to the next level.
Yeah. So knowing that marginalized people are oftentimes doing this work, how do you recommend them having the conversation with allies, more specifically, or white men? Because I imagine that they would be more receptive to you facilitating the conversation, being that you are a white man. So I guess, do you have any advice for those looking to broach that conversation with some of their white male leaders who may be receptive, but just like need some type of guidance?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not always the case that white male leaders are willing to learn from other white men. It's because this is an area where we're taught, right, that we should be learning from people, people who aren't like us, people who have marginalized experiences inside of the systems we work in. And so that can then put a lot of pressure on, folks of color, on LGBTQ plus folks, et cetera, to be the teachers of white men. And once again, that's more labor. So, I think the key thing here that I found is it's not about information. Information is important, don't get me wrong, but it's about reaching leaders in their heart. And I think the only way, or the best way that I've found to do that, is through stories. And so when you share, the setting has to be appropriate, and, there has to be some spaciousness to actually listen, but to share just some of your experience, like, hey, I was checking my mailbox last week and somebody thought that I was stealing the mail. And it's like, are you serious? So like, just to have a few stories that you can share with leaders that helps them kind of snap out of this belief that the white male lens is in fact the way everyone walks through the world, because it's not, of course. But we don't necessarily see that because we've been enculturated to believe that that is the norm and that it's the experience everybody else is having too.
Yeah, that resonates with me because I used to work at IBM and I was the only Black person on my team of like 11 or 12. And after the Black Lives Matter movement, I had a conversation with my manager who happened to be a white man. And I was explaining my experience and he was like, I don't think I treat you any different than the rest of the team. And I'm like, therein kind of lies the issue, is that like, I have different experiences. So like the support that you're giving the rest of the team doesn't necessarily apply to me as a Black woman. And I think he was like mind blown, and we continue to have those conversations. And it was such a coaching moment and like a genuine moment of allyship within that. So no, that makes a lot of sense. So in my work as a Chezi founder, I talk to ERG leaders and DEI managers every day, and they're often asking around or questions about like, how can allies be involved in the work of ERGs? I think people are curious on like how to authentically hold space for the marginalized communities while also having space for allies. I'd just love to get your thoughts on that. And I know that's a broad question, but like, how do you think that allies can best show up or support the work of ERGs at their respective organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, first of all, allies can get interested and get curious and show real commitment to showing up. And if that means that an ERG decides to do like an open session or invite a couple select people in to sit in and witness, great.
Yeah.
But I also want to be really thoughtful about those spaces providing what the participants need, and not just sort of being there to look after the needs or the learning of someone from the outside. And so I'm actually more an advocate for, like sponsorship is great, but also like reverse mentorship, or even co-mentorship, where there can be relationships of learning across leadership levels potentially, but definitely across difference in terms of identity. And in that environment, there can be a real agreement to listen and to receive feedback and to be open to change. I think this is something that's really key in the work I do with white male leaders. Is a lot of times when we feel like our sense of self is fixed, then feedback can occur as a threat. But when we feel our sense of self as evolving and, more in flow, like as a lifelong learner, then feedback is a gift. So we need to create some of the conditions, put those conditions in place so that the co-learning and co-mentorship can actually really serve its purpose. But the other part that I think is really important here is I really believe that white male leaders and white men in general, we actually do need dedicated spaces to do our learning around this work. Now, they shouldn't be ERGs. That's not what ERGs were created for. And I don't want to conflate, the original intention of ERGs with an interest group, right? Or an affinity group. But I do think it's really important to have accountable white men's spaces where we can do learning around this stuff. So we can be in partnership rather than just being the person who kind of flies in, learns a thing or two and flies out, imagining that this isn't really about us. Right?
I guess question on having spaces that are dedicated to white men is like, you mentioned being accountable spaces. Like, how do we have that accountability within those groups? And then who, if someone can't bring in like a you, for example, who is facilitating those groups to make sure that they are accountable to the overall DEI efforts of the organization?
Yeah, so if you can't bring in a really skilled outside facilitator, then
Yeah.
don't do them because they're likely going to cause more harm than good. And that's the sad truth, but it is. And so you need really skillful outside facilitation. You need someone who's not embedded in existing power dynamics within your organization, but has an outside perspective. And in this case, I really think you need a white male to facilitate with other white men, because there's just something different that happens there. And so, but in terms of accountability, it's critical on a couple levels. So I'm personally accountable in all of my practice and all of my work in DEI to a DEI leader who's a BIPOC woman here in Denver. And so we meet twice a month and we talk through things and challenges and issues, and she holds me accountable. So that level is sort of the baseline. But then when I work with a client, I'm always looking for who is my point person inside the organization who is in charge of DEI or in charge of HR and sort of the DEI initiative within it. And in particular, I'm looking for someone who's not white or male, who I can partner with and who I can build a relationship with where they know they can give me feedback and they know that that I'm open and that together we're going to be on a learning journey rather than me sort of like doing my own thing with blinders on. And then the other part of that is I want to make sure that if the person internally is really skillful in the work, great, we can partner. Maybe they come in and they sit in a few of those sessions and kind of get a feel for what's happening. If the person on the inside is maybe newer to DEI work and it's something they've just kind of been given as a responsibility, then I might suggest actually bringing in one of my collaborators, particular a woman of color who does this work day in and day out and can bring sort of that perspective to complement my own. And I think that's important because without accountability, then we open up real possibility for just additional harm to happen, even if we mean well.
Right. And I think that was my fear when I hear, let's have a white male space. It's like, you never know. And I guess, you just never know where it could go. So thank you for that feedback. I think one of the greatest pieces of pushback I get around allyship within ERGs is that some people believe that the inclusion of allies could be detrimental to like the safe space that these groups were trying to provide. I guess, what are your thoughts on this? Like, how can ERG leaders include allies in their efforts while still holding space for the unrepresented communities that they serve?
Carefully and thoughtfully, because I think you're right. Like, the reality is that the gap between intentions and impact is pretty pronounced for a lot of us white folks and white men in particular. Many of us mean well. We don't want to cause more harm. We want to say the right thing, quote unquote, but without a deep willingness to engage in our own learning journey, we're gonna mess up. And the question is, what is gonna contain that messiness? Is there structure in place for that? And if it's a microaggression or some other harm inside of an ERG, that can have create real pain. And so, for everyone. And so I think my advice for somebody who wants to come in and participate in an ERG is listen and don't talk much at all, because it's not about you. And then my advice is to have that happen pretty rarely, and much more often to have those spaces closed so that they can be focused on the needs and the experiences of folks who are experiencing marginalization all the time, When
I get that question, that's oftentimes my advice is like, I understand the want to, or the push to have allies included in ERGs, but I do think that ERG leaders should be very intentional about this is a space for my community. This is a space for me to uplift and celebrate and amplify the voices of my community. And while we allow allies in those spaces from here time to time, it's not necessarily a space for them. So I think the grand scheme of things, it's sure, allow allies in your spaces, but don't be afraid to have closed off events where you just need a conversation from marginalized person to marginalized person. I think that is well within the right of any ERG leader. I appreciate that feedback. So we all know the importance of having executive sponsors for ERGs, with their primary role being to amplify the voices of the ERG members and other people of the community. But given that many of these executive sponsors will be allies just due to the lack of representation at the executive level, how should ERG leaders best work with their sponsors and or train them on how to be most effective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like I'll just own that I don't feel like I'm an expert in this area. I do have some thoughts I can share, but I think it's important just to acknowledge like where I'm not an expert. So, but I will say around executive sponsors, it's interesting because I think they have the most effectiveness when they are really committed to listening and then taking action on what they hear. So it's not just let me go listen and witness this group having a process and then be like, oh, that was interesting.
Right.
It's like, no, you're listening so that you can take accountable action. Like that's the only reason you're there. And so I think that needs to be really clear that it's not like you're a spectator. It's like you are coming alongside and working in partnership, and it's an honor and a privilege to be there. And so I think setting the framework appropriately is, so that people have that awareness as they come in is really key. But I also think that, this is where accountability comes in again. How are those executive sponsors holding themselves accountable to the kinds of action and changes that ERGs are calling for? And if there isn't a system in place to really track that or to see it through to completion or see progress happen, then that needs to be put in place. Yep. And that I think could be done in partnership with maybe an ERG lead and a sponsor to say, hey, this is how you'll know that we're making progress. These are some of the ways we're tracking that, whether it's that folks are experiencing a lot of marginalization in the organization today, are experiencing less harm or fewer microaggressions, or feel like they're able to bring more of themselves to the workplace, or that multiple different leadership styles are valued, or that they're specifically invited into advancement conversations, or that performance reviews include DEI engagement and learning. All those types of things are ways of indicating that you actually mean it when you're a sponsor rather than just lip service.
Yeah. And for ERG leaders, I always recommend having a job description, clearly laying out the roles and responsibilities of these executive sponsors so that you can hold them accountable. Knowing that their primary responsibility is to take the conversations happening at the ERG level to leadership to get things, progressing, hold them accountable to that and let them know at the beginning, hey, this is what we're looking for, just so they're aware and that they can actively decide if they can live up to that expectation as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to pause just so our audience knows we are going to open this up to a Q&A after this discussion. So feel free to drop questions into the chat or I will open it up for people to come off mute. But we do want this to be, an active conversation and engaging conversation. So think of questions now, and we'll open that up in a little bit. Another question for you is, what advice do you have for allies who want to get involved in ERGs or DEI efforts, but don't know how best to engage?
Yeah, that happens a lot where there's sort of disconnect between hey, yeah, I really value DEI. And on the other hand, I'm not actually showing up to anything, and I think that, there was a study that just came out with Lean In and McKinsey and company around women in the workplace. And there was some interesting data there showing that 90% of organizations say that DEI is a top or very important priority. And yet very few are actually engaging sufficiently to create change. And I think women, and in particular women of color, are at least 2 times as likely to be doing unpaid work around DEI than their white male counterparts. So there's still just this huge divide. And so I think the first step oftentimes is just to help white men and white male leaders to see that they have a role, that there's actually an important place for them in this work, that we're needed. and that we have important capacities and experiences to bring to the table in order to actually change the way things are happening. And so if we see that we're needed and that we have a role, then that I think allows folks to lean in a bit more versus feeling like, oh, it's not about me or I'm not part of it. And then the next thing to overcome is really that defensiveness of like, well, I feel like I'm being attacked or that I'm the problem or, you know, blah, blah, blah. And because there was a study that came out a couple of years ago of white male leaders, and they like spoke to about 2,000 folks and said, you know, around DEI, how comfortable do you feel sort of engaging and do you feel included? And about 70% of white male leaders said they felt forgotten by DEI initiatives. So, you know, it's pretty passive language. What is it to feel forgotten? We can also take initiative and get engaged, but there's also something really real here, which is the emotional feeling of like, I don't know what my role is here. So I think a lot of it is just helping people see their role, overcome resistance, or just name resistance, get it out there, and then learn. So this is where the information does come in. We have to actually learn about our history. We have to learn about the way that history is very much present today, and the way that this isn't about pointing out bad actors like KKK individual bad actors, but like structural inequality, structural racism, and that the structures don't mean that I, Dan, am a terrible human being just because I'm a white male. They mean that I have been enculturated into a system where I'm participating in racism and sexism, even if I don't want to be. And so I can divest myself from that. I can actually join in the community of people who are doing this work and have been doing this work for generations. And I can see myself in a different culture rather than becoming this sort of avid defender of the status quo.
And when they are involved or looking to get involved, what are some things that they should be mindful of? Because I do think that, again, just kind of having that awareness that, like, even with ERGs, for instance, like having the awareness that this is a space they're inviting me into, this isn't necessarily a space for me. So like, what other things should they be mindful of as they look to engage?
Yeah, well, I'm drawing on my own experience here, which has been plenty messy over my own learning journey. I think maybe some folks here will know about the drama triangle and the perpetrator, the victim, and the rescuer. And I think in my haste to move away from the perpetrator role, I often became the rescuer. And that's white saviorism, that's white knighting, it's all the things, right? And it's sometimes showing up to protect other people when in fact, I just need to like do my own work. I need to slow down and create some space. And so it's a really interesting paradox to engage in this work as an ally, because on the one hand, we're getting this message, you need to just listen. Like, this is not your area, but you need to be here, right? But on the other hand, we're getting this message oftentimes sort of as we're a little bit further on our equity learning journey, the message of you need to speak up. Like, where's your voice? You know, you're just quiet. And so it can feel like, I'm confused. What am I supposed to do? And I think it really just comes down to like, there's a developmental journey that we go on as allies. And by the way, an ally is not something you become, it's something we practice. But there's a developmental journey. And at an earlier stage, you do need to listen. As you start doing your work and building a relationship and you understand more of how this works, then you do need to speak up and take up some space and like take a stand and really create opportunity for marginal people who are part of marginalized groups around you to have their voices heard and step into their power and their leadership. So I think that's one of the key things I like to point out early on is just like, it's not a simple checklist of like how to be an ally. It's an evolving, emergent, journey in partnership and community. And there's no one size fits all. So it's about being self-aware, being emotionally agile and intelligent so that we can be in the moment and flow in the moment instead of having like the right and wrong that so sort of underpins domination-based culture.
And for those looking to actively engage in allyship, what are some resources that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there are a few resources I really love, and the list keeps growing. One is The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love by Bell Hooks. Just an incredible book that really, I think, invites men into the conversation around feminism, and really shows that this work is about rehumanizing ourselves in community. Then there is Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment by Leticia Nieto. It's a book about the developmental journey of engaging in DEI work and the intersectional nature of, DEI. And then most importantly, looking at the difference between oppression and dehumanization, and the way that we all bear a cost of participating in these systems, even when we have privilege within them. So that's another great resource. And then I'm also a big fan of Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. I find that the work really, it has to start in the body. It has to be about the nervous system and settling. I find that I recreate and cause a lot of harm and painful dynamics when I'm unsettled, when I'm sort of in my head and not grounded in my body. But when I can really get into my body, I can slow down my pace, and there's a little more space to be open to the learning and the discomfort and the challenges that are coming, to embrace conflict as generative instead of just a threat, for example. So Resmaa's work is really important. And then, I'm also a fan of Ta-Nehisi Coates and his sort of poetic storytelling style, and the way that he brings you in to feel what he's feeling, or what he's the story he's sharing of someone else. There's a vividness and sort of hits me in the heart in a way that some other works don't. And so that's another resource that I appreciate. And finally, I'll mention a book called The Sum of Us. I believe it's by Heather McKee. And this is about the zero-sum game mentality. So, one person's gain is another person's loss, right? This sort of foundation of the domination-based consciousness, which is we can't all win. So if I'm on top now and somebody wants to create more equity, that means I'm going to lose. So that mentality creates so much stuckness for a lot of folks, when in fact, it's basically just a lie. And Heather McKee does a great job of outlining the way that logic is harming, in particular, working class white folks. And even as working class white folks are sometimes, advocating for segregationist policy, right, or unequal treatment. And so, and by the way, not just working class, like white folks across the board. But to be clear, she makes a case that we all stand to benefit by building more equitable policies and institutions and systems, and that there's this fundamental lie that white folks actually stand to lose things through those efforts. Because while we may feel like we're risking status or power or losing belonging or whatever else, like what we have to gain far outweighs those losses.
Awesome. And we will share those resources and those books with the audience after this call, so you have links and things to them. And last question for you before we open it up to our audience for Q&A is, how can people get in touch with you? Where can they learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so you can go to my website. It's danmahle.com, or you can send me an email, danmahleconsulting@gmail.com. We'll send that out after as well. But the website's a great place to start, learn more about my approach and kind of how I work. And I'm happy to have a one-on-one call and learn more about the challenges and opportunities that you have in front of you.
Awesome. Yeah, take advantage of Dan. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you being so open and giving our audience such great advice on how to engage and reach out to allies. So thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
Our audience, I am looking to you all. Do you have any questions for Dan as we continue this conversation? You can feel free to drop a question in the chat and I can read it off, or you can come off mute and ask the question directly. Okay, question in the chat. What are your thoughts on diversity of thought to make everyone feel included?
I'm not a fan. I think it's a cop-out. I think diversity of thought is a way of making DEI feel palatable to those who aren't ready to really grapple with the discomfort that's inherent in the work. So not to say that diversity of thought isn't a good thing, it's a great thing, but diversity of thought is a result of building an equitable and inclusive workplace, not a stand-in for doing so.
Great question. Anyone else? We had a lot of questions during the registration process, so okay, maybe I just ask some of these.
There's one more question that came through just now.
There's?
Like,
okay, good. So if you were starting up ERGs, would you initially close them to allies and then phase them in? I guess what would your approach be?
yes, I think that would be a good approach. Now, when I'm starting a white men's caucus group or affinity group, I actually initially have it maybe more open so that we get clear about what it is that we're working toward together. And sometimes that means bringing in, you know, a BIPOC leader or someone who has experience that is necessary for our learning as we launch into the group together. But for an ERG, absolutely start closed, understand who you are, what the needs are, get real with each other, you know, like be a support system to each other, and don't worry about inviting guests or visitors in until you feel like you have some solidity.
Yeah.
I think that's the best starting point.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think like when we look at the foundation of an ERG, it starts with like mission, vision, values. And I think you can only get that if you have impact from people that, or input from people who are directly impacted by your ERG. And that's going to be members of the community. I would start there. I would get a pulse of like what members of this community need from your organization or from your ERG in order to feel a sense of belonging, in order to feel supported by the organization, and then start to expand into how allies can support that. Gina, I see you have your hand raised. You can come off mute if you'd want to ask the question.
Yes, thank you so much for being the white male in the room. we need to. So I have been about allyship and ERGs for many years, and that's the big challenge, is how to bring in the white male, or even the white male mentality, because a lot of Latinos have this, including my husband. And so, you know, you don't want to push them out. You want to make them feel included. So I'm loving your ideas. My question is, I guess it's around, hold on, give me 1 second because I'm losing it. I might have lost it. So you're, I guess, oh, okay, so here it is. We don't want to make anyone, especially people that have higher level superiority, whether they're corporate execs or white males or whatever. We don't want them to make them feel like they have to be trained, like here's some training, you should go through it. What you mentioned a couple of things already, but can you bring a couple more ideas, dig deep into this idea of making them feel like they're not being trained, like we need you kind of mentality. That's what I really latched onto that, and that's the one I love.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, and I appreciate you also naming that dominance-based culture or white culture isn't just something that white people bring into the world. It's something that I think affects a lot of folks. And so, but yeah, I think one of the things that I like to do, as I mentioned before, start with story, start with narrative. You know, I'm not talking about like, hey, let's go back to kindergarten and have storytelling time. No, it's like, talk about it as like, this is a competitive advantage. Like we need to know our story about ourselves, about the world, about our workplace. And we need to know when our stories are not aligned. And when in fact, we have things we can learn from each other because of those differences. And so oftentimes, like when I do white men's groups or even just men's groups in organizations around this work, we'll start there. We'll start with like, what has it been like to be enculturated into masculinity? Let's start there for a moment. Oh, you thought that, you had to squash all your emotions and you had to pretend like you had it all figured out and you had all the answers. And there are all these things that we can connect on and build some trust and some safety amongst ourselves around, so that then when we dive into finding our role in the larger community around DEI, we have a foundation, and there's a sense of like people feel seen, not just for here are the gaps in your awareness that we need to help you fill, but in fact, here are the opportunities that you can come and join us to explore.
Thank you so much. Those are fantastic specifics. And just super quick story. I did a couple of those. You reminded me. One was in high school. We did a reunion thing, and somebody said, we never experienced this crap in high school, and it turned out to be a 90 message feedback of what somebody did experience, what somebody, in all these different situations. So yes, once you start these conversations, everything starts bubbling up, but it's starting. That's the hard part. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Awesome. Question from Mike. Do you ever have conversations about who belongs in the group versus who is an ally? What about mixed people? I've been hesitant to exclude allies from my Latin ERG because it's hard to say who is and who isn't.
I think if you identify as someone who
right.
Is part of the group, that you should include yourself. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're a white man like me, you should say, I identify as a person of color, so therefore, and like, no, there's a certain line, but especially when it comes to mixed race folks or folks with lots of intersectional identities, like you determine where you belong. Yeah. But I'm curious to maybe what you think about that one.
No, I completely agree. I don't think it's anyone's job to identify someone else. I think it is a self-identity thing. And just like making sure people are ethical in their response. Like that example that you just named, like I think there is intentional harm being done if you're like, hey, I'm just gonna like check off that I am actually a member just so I can like be in this group and like have part in this conversation. I think most people will, people identify for themselves. I don't think we have a place to like put an identity on someone. So I don't necessarily think it is the job of an ERG leader to say who is in the group and who is an ally. I think you have to allow people to kind of like self-select or self-identify for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question that we got during the registration process that I'd love for you to answer. So the question is, although our ERGs all say that they welcome allies, none of the ERGs do anything to actively engage with them. What are the top 1 to 2 things ERG leaders can do to actively engage allies in conversation? And I think this kind of goes back to like, I think ERG leaders are, they want to authentically hold space for their communities, but they also want to include allies just because they know like the force or the, the impact that allies can have on the conversation, but they don't know how to do that. So if you have any thoughts there, I think that would be helpful.
I agree with you. And I think part of it is that the work is never done. So like we talked earlier about getting to a point of initial sort of grounding in your group, that grounding only lasts until the next blow up, until the next thing happens, the next harm and the next processing that needs to happen, right? So it can feel like you're never there. And I think the work has to happen in parallel, where allies come in and visit, or where sponsorship happens, even as you might decide last minute to close the group because actually the session tonight, you need to process some harm that happened that day. And so there needs to be some agility to it rather than it being any kind of formula. But I think first of all, really checking in to see if a potential sponsor or visitor understands their responsibility in being a visitor. or being a sponsor, if they understand that, as we talked earlier, about like their responsibility to take accountable action, that's one key step. And then another step is really making sure that there's a structure in place for follow through. So that it's not just like, yeah, that was an interesting experience. I'll take it to the leadership team. We'll talk about it. We'll see. But it's like, well, what is actually going to happen? And it's not all going to happen overnight. Of course not. This work takes lifetimes. But what is, if your group can identify a couple of core priorities that feel really important and urgent, and then those can be prioritized by leadership, that feels like an important step, because then they're actually working on the things that are going to move the dial around what matters, instead of things that might look good or be markety or, feel easy, but don't ultimately make the change that's needed.
That's awesome. I will if anyone else have any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. Okay. Any specific response to, are they being too sensitive?
Who?
Gina, if you want to explain that one further, that would be great.
Sorry, did it too fast. These conversations that I mentioned earlier, like in high school, and tend to start with the first person saying something and then being blamed for being too sensitive with whatever they were sensitized about.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. And I'm going to go deep here for a moment, if you don't mind, which is deep into the psyche of
love it.
masculine conditioning, which is typically when a man says you're being too sensitive, you're taking it too seriously, it's because we're afraid of our own emotions. And in fact, there's an impact for us and we're feeling something, but we don't want to go there because it's too scary, too exposing. And so you're being too sensitive is a convenient way to deflect the emotional charge, so that we don't have to actually be responsible for our own experience.
Ooh, we will end it on
oh my gosh.
We will end it on that note. Dan, thank you so much for this conversation. It brought so much value to myself as well as our audience. I will let you have the final words. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Just that it's an honor to be here, Jimmy, and thank you for the invitation, and appreciate everybody who's with us on the call. And if you have questions or you want to follow up with a conversation, I'm very happy to do so. So look forward to more.
Cool. Thank you so much for being here, and our audience, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Dan. And then also you can reach out to myself at demaby@chesy.co. I will send over a follow-up email either this afternoon or tomorrow with the recording of this and some links for additional learning. So thank you all again. Have a great rest of your Thursday. All right. Bye, y'all.
Thanks so much.